Nobody told me the Velkareth Grand Circuit still ran under the old law. That oversight, I would later understand, was not an accident. The circuit's administration had been quietly hoping for 40 years that nobody would invoke it again. The clause sat in the founding charter the way an old mine sits in a field, mapped, documented, theoretically harmless so long as nobody stepped on it. I stepped on it, or rather, a princess stepped on it on my behalf, which amounts to the same thing. My name is Joran Veth. I am 43 years old. I spent 22 years as an infantry sergeant in the Compact Joint Forces, the last 6 of which were on the outer frontier, which is a formal way of saying I spent 6 years in places where the Compact's authority was more of a suggestion than a fact on the ground. I came out of that service with 2 repaired fractures in my left forearm, a hearing deficit in my right ear, and a general disposition toward solving problems with the minimum necessary action rather than the maximum available force. My commanding officers had opinions about that disposition. Most of them were wrong. After I mustered out, I spent 2 years doing contract security work on the circuit station circuit, the orbital arenas where the Velkareth run their grand competition seasons. Security detail on a combat contest station is not glamorous work. You stand at access corridors. You check credentials. You escort injured contestants to the medical bay. Occasionally, someone tries to bring a non-regulation weapon into the staging area, and you have a conversation about it. The pay is adequate, and the schedule is predictable, and nobody is shooting at me, which after 22 years represents a significant quality of life improvement. The reason I ended up on the circuit floor as a contestant rather than behind a credential reader has to do with a paperwork error, and a conversation I had with Station Administrator Velorveth Keen approximately 16 hours before the opening round of the Velkareth Grand Circuit's 403rd season. The short version, one of the registered entrants, a Velsorn combat specialist from the 3rd-tier rankings, withdrew with a joint compression injury the morning of the draw. This left the bracket with an open slot. The administrator needed a filler. She looked at the available personnel, most of whom were support staff with no combat credential of any kind. She looked at me. She looked at my service record, which she had pulled for the standard security clearance review. She noted 22 years of Compact Joint Forces, the frontier posting, the marksmanship certifications, and the hand-to-hand instruction qualification I had picked up in year 14, because the unit needed a trainer and I was available. She offered me the slot. She was clear that she expected me to last approximately 2 rounds before being eliminated, which would fill the bracket without wasting a credentialed competitor's time. The entrant fee would be waived. I would receive the standard first-round withdrawal compensation regardless of how far I progressed, which was more than my weekly security detail rate. I said yes, I'm a practical man. What I did not know, because the administrator had not mentioned it, and I had not read the founding charter in any detail, was that the Velkareth Grand Circuit still operated under the Kethvale Prize Designation Compact of the 3rd century, which predated the current compact governance framework by approximately 800 years, and had never been formally superseded, because superseding it would have required a unanimous vote of the 7 sovereign houses, and the 7 sovereign houses had never agreed on anything unanimously in recorded history. The Kethvale Compact established that any sovereign rank observer present at the Grand Circuit had the right, at the conclusion of the final round, to invoke a prize claim on any entrant who had demonstrated the 3 qualities: sustained endurance, maintained composure under impossible odds, and the refusal to dishonor the contest through yielding before the round's natural conclusion. The prize claim, once formally invoked before the circuit's administrative witnesses, constituted a binding designation under galactic contest law. The claimed party retained the right to refuse, but refusal required a formal petition to the prize designation chamber, and the chamber's adjudication could take up to 30 standard days, during which both parties remained in a designated proximity status under the old law. I found all of this out from a very apologetic station administrator approximately 40 minutes after the final round ended, while I was sitting in the medical bay having my nose reset. She kept apologizing. I kept listening. Outside the medical bay window, the docking ring was cycling through its standard approach pattern, and the lights of the Sovereign Gallery ship were still visible against the station's hull. Let me back up. The 11 rounds took place across 3 standard days. The Grand Circuit runs bracket-style single elimination, with the brackets seeded by prior season ranking. As the filler slot entrant, I drew the lowest seed position, which meant my first opponent was the entrant ranked immediately above filler in the bracket, a Velsorn combat specialist named Velthar Orvek, who had placed 6th in the previous season, and had arms that were approximately 1.5 times the length of mine. The Velkareth Grand Circuit is a hand-to-hand discipline competition. No weapons, protective equipment on the joints and skull. The floor is padded but not soft. A round ends when one contestant yields when the medical override is triggered or when the time limit expires and the judges score on points. In the points system, a yield scores 0. A time limit decision scores on accumulated contact and control. The thing most contestants try to avoid is a time limit decision against a better opponent, because a time limit decision means you spent the entire round getting controlled and hit and still did not yield, which tells the next opponent something about you that you might prefer they not know. I was aware that I was outclassed in every measurable category by every opponent I would face. I had 22 years of infantry hand-to-hand training, which is designed to produce practitioners who can neutralize a threat effectively in field conditions, not to produce competitive circuit athletes who have trained their entire careers in this specific discipline. The gap between those two things is significant. What I had, in addition to the training, was the particular quality of stubbornness that you develop when you spend 6 years on a frontier posting, where quitting is not an available option. You learn to make the calculation not about whether you can win, but about what the minimum necessary action is to remain functional until circumstances change. You stop thinking about the round as something you need to win. You think about it as something you need to survive until the clock runs out. Velthar Orvek was better than me. He was faster, stronger, more technically precise, and he had a reach advantage that I could not compensate for with positioning alone. He won the points decision by a margin that the judges later described in the official record as decisive. I did not yield. In the staging area afterward, one of the other security staff, a Velkareth woman named Orvath who had been doing this work for 11 years, looked at me with an expression I could not quite read and said, "You know you can just yield, right? Nobody expects you to last the full round." "I know," I said. "Then why didn't you?" I thought about it. "Because the round wasn't over," I said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. She brought me a cold pack for my jaw and did not say anything else about it. Round 2 was a Velkareth combat specialist from the 2nd tier. Round 3 was another Velsorn entrant, this one with a particular specialty in ground control work that was extremely unpleasant to experience from the inside. Rounds 4 through 6 were progressively worse in the same way that a hill becomes progressively steeper. The degree of difference between my capability and my opponents continued to increase, and the margin by which I failed to win the points decision continued to widen. I did not yield in any of them. I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling this story as a story about courage or exceptional determination. 22 years of infantry service does not produce a person who feels particularly heroic about refusing to quit. It produces a person who has simply stopped recognizing yielding as a category that applies to the current situation, in the way that a fish does not recognize drowning as a personal concern. The rounds ended when the clock said they ended. I was there until then. That was the whole of it. What I did not know, because I was focused on surviving each successive round rather than on the sovereign gallery above the circuit floor, was that Princess Velsorn Ethai had been in that gallery since round 2. I learned this later. She told me herself, which I will get to. The sovereign gallery at Kethorval Prime is a glass-walled observation tier 3 levels above the circuit floor, reserved for registered observers of sovereign rank or higher. It is separated from the general spectator sections by a physical partition and a credential checkpoint. The occupants of the sovereign gallery are not visible from the circuit floor under normal lighting conditions. The circuit floor's overhead lights are calibrated to the competitor's visibility needs, which leaves the gallery in relative shadow from below. She had apparently been watching since I went 11 minutes against the round 2 specialist and did not yield. She told me later that she had initially watched because the result was statistically unusual. A filler slot entrant going a full time limit decision against a second-tier specialist was not expected by the bracket projections. She had accessed my registration data from the gallery terminal and read the service record. 22 years. Outer frontier posting. The hand-to-hand instruction qualification. She kept watching because of something she said she could not fully articulate at the time, which she eventually settled on describing as the specific quality of a person who has decided that the situation around them is not a sufficient reason to become a different person than they already are. I have spent some time thinking about that description. I believe it is accurate, though I would not have put it that way myself. By round 7, the general spectator sections had begun paying attention to the filler slot entrant in a way that is unusual for bracket positions at that level. The scoring decisions were not close. I was losing every round by the judge's margin. But I was still there at the end of each clock, and the specific quality of being still there when the math says you should not be tends to attract notice. Round 11 was against Velkareth Sunorvath, the previous season's third-place finisher, a combat specialist who had been competing at the top tier of the circuit for 9 years. The circuit commentary, which I could hear faintly through the staging bay's ventilation feed while I was wrapping my hands before the round, spent approximately 4 minutes discussing him and approximately 45 seconds discussing me, primarily to note that the filler slot entrant had survived to round 11 through means that the commentators found simultaneously impressive and difficult to articulate in terms the scoring metrics could contain. He was, in the clinical assessment of the judge's pre-round analysis, categorically superior to me in every measurable dimension. The round was expected to be brief, not because I would yield, since by round 11 my non-yielding had been established clearly enough that the circuit commentary was treating it as a known fact about me, but because Velkareth Sunorvath was good enough to force the medical override. He did not force the medical override. He came close twice. The override threshold requires a specific physiological response pattern, and I was at the edge of it on the 8-minute mark and again at the 12-minute mark, and both times I was not quite there, and both times the referee let the round continue. The clock ran out at 15 minutes. The judges scored the decision for Velkareth Sunorvath by the widest margin of any round I had fought. He had controlled me for approximately 13 of the 15 minutes. He had not been able to make me yield or reach the override threshold, which are the only 2 ways to finish a round before the clock, and neither of those facts appear in the scoring metrics. He looked at me after the judge's announcement, standing in the center of the circuit floor, while the spectator sections were making a noise I had not heard before from a competition audience. He said something in Old Velkareth that I did not have the vocabulary to translate. Later, Orvath, the security staff woman, told me it translated roughly as, "I have fought 9 seasons on this circuit, and I have never been unable to put a man down." He did not sound angry. He sounded like a person reassessing a prior assumption. I was in the process of reassessing my nose, which had taken a contact at the 10-minute mark that I was fairly confident had done something structural. I was about to ask one of the medical staff whether I should go to the bay now or after the closing formalities when the circuit's administrative announcer said, in a voice that carried across the entire station, "The sovereign right invocation is now in session. All parties, please remain on the floor." I did not know what that meant. Orvath, who was standing at the access corridor with her credential reader, closed her eyes briefly. Then she looked at me with an expression that was approximately equal parts sympathy and amusement and said, very quietly, "You might want to stand up straight." I stood up straight. From the sovereign gallery above, a voice I had not heard before said, in compact standard, clearly enough to be heard across the floor, "Under the Kethvale Prize Designation Compact, 3rd Century, Article 7, Subsection 4, I invoke prize claim designation on the entrant registered as Joran Veth, filler slot bracket position, on the basis of sustained endurance, maintained composure under impossible odds, and the refusal to dishonor the contest through yielding before the round's natural conclusion." There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the spectator sections erupted in a volume of noise that I suspect affected my already compromised hearing more than I was willing to admit at the time. The administrator, Velor Vethkeen, appeared at my elbow with the expression of a person who had known this clause was in the charter for her entire professional career and had devoutly hoped never to experience it in an operational context. She said, "The invocation has been formally recorded. You have the right to petition the prize designation chamber. Would you like to?" "Who just claimed me?" I said. She hesitated. "Her Sovereign Highness Velsorn Ethai, third heir to the Velsorn sovereignty. She has been in the gallery since round 2. I looked up at the gallery. The lighting conditions had not changed. I could see the glass wall and the shadow behind it. I could not see a face. "How long does the chamber petition take?" I said. "Up to 30 days, the administrator said, "during which both parties remain in designated proximity status at this station." I thought about this, and if I don't petition. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she had not expected that question. "Then the designation is bilaterally confirmed within 48 hours, and the compact terms take effect." I nodded. My nose was doing something I was going to need a medical opinion about. "Tell the administrator of the prize designation chamber I'll be there in the morning," I said, "after I've had my nose looked at." I want to explain what I was thinking in that moment, because I am aware that the decision I was making appears, from the outside, to be considerably more significant than I treated it at the time. What I was thinking was this. I had spent 11 rounds on that circuit floor. I had been hit by some of the best combat specialists in the Velkareth system. My nose needed medical attention. I was tired in the specific way that you become tired after 3 days of doing something extremely physically demanding while also being hit repeatedly. I was not capable, in that state, of making a large decision about a thing I did not fully understand yet. What I was capable of was deciding not to petition immediately on reflex, which felt like the wrong reason to petition. 30 days of proximity status seemed like enough time to understand the situation before deciding anything permanent about it. I am an infantry sergeant. You do not commit to an action until you have assessed the ground. So I went to the medical bay. And then the administrator came in and explained the prize claim clause in significant detail, with several apologies, and I listened to all of it and asked a few clarifying questions, and then I said, "I'll still be at the chamber in the morning." She looked at me with the same expression Orvath had used. "You understand what the compact terms entail." "I understand that they're 800 years old and were written for a different set of circumstances," I said. "I also understand that the woman who invoked them has been watching me get methodically worked over on that floor for 3 days, which is a specific kind of attention that I'd like to understand better before I decide anything about it. The administrator left. I sat with the cold pack on my nose and watched the docking ring lights outside the window, and thought about a princess I had not seen yet watching from a shadow gallery, and choosing, out of all the options available to her, to invoke an 800-year-old clause on a retired infantry sergeant with a filler slot bracket position. It is the specificity of a choice that tells you the most about the person making it. She had not claimed Velkareth Su-Norvath, who had placed third the previous season, and was by any measurable standard a more impressive specimen. She had not claimed any of the upper bracket competitors whose names I vaguely recognized from the circuit standings. She had claimed the man who could not win a single round and who could not be made to yield. That told me something. I was not sure yet what exactly, but it told me something. The prize designation chamber is a formal room on level 7 of the station's administrative section. It has the particular aesthetic of spaces that are used rarely enough that the furniture remains in excellent condition. Pale stone surfaces, chairs that have not been worn by years of occupants, overhead lighting calibrated for the reading of legal documents. 2 administrative witnesses occupied positions at the far end of the central table. The circuit's legal officer, Velthar Sae, sat at the head of the table with a document that I suspected was the Keth Vale Compact itself, or at least the relevant sections of it. Princess Velsorn Ethai was already in the room when I arrived. I had imagined several versions of her during the night, which is an unavoidable consequence of having information without image. She was not quite any of them. She was standing at the room's single window, looking at the docking ring below. She was wearing a formal Velsorn court garment in deep indigo that was not the kind of thing you wear to a combat circuit, which meant she had changed after leaving the gallery. Her skin was a lavender gray that shifted slightly in the window's light, not quite the shade I would have named if asked to guess at the Velsorn sovereign house coloring from the description. Her hair was dark silver, pulled into a formal braid with the kind of precision that takes either time or assistance. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were pale gold, and they were assessing me in a way that was frank enough that I did not feel the need to pretend I was not assessing her in return. She was younger than I had expected. 29, I would later confirm. She had the particular composed quality of someone who makes decisions and lives with them, which is not the same as the composed quality of someone who has never faced a decision that cost them anything. Joran Veth, she said, not a question. Your Sovereign Highness, I said, because I had spent the night reviewing the appropriate forms of address, and it seemed like the right time to use them. Something shifted in her expression. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. I'm doing it anyway. The legal officer cleared his throat. If both parties are present, we can begin the designation review. We sat. The legal officer explained the compact terms in the formal language of 800-year-old galactic law, which took approximately 20 minutes and covered territory that the administrator had already summarized for me, plus several additional provisions about seasonal renewal and the rights and responsibilities of both parties that I had not previously been aware of. The princess listened to all of it with an attention that suggested she had already read it, and more than once. When the legal officer finished, he said, "The claimed party has the right to present any formal objection to the designation. Joran Veth, do you wish to present a formal objection?" I had spent the night thinking about what I was going to say at this point. I had written down several versions and discarded all of them. What I finally said was, "I have a question first." The legal officer blinked. "A question?" Yes, I looked at the princess. Why me? It was not the most elegant question I have ever asked. It was the accurate one. She looked at me steadily. You want me to explain the invocation criteria? I want you to explain the part the criteria don't explain, I said. Velkareth Su-Norvath placed third last season. By any standard metric, he was a more impressive entrant than I was. You watched 11 rounds and chose the man who lost all of them. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Outside, I could hear the standard station ambient noise, ventilation, the distant hum of the docking ring's mechanical systems. The criteria require endurance, composure, and the refusal to dishonor the contest, she said. Velkareth Sunorveth demonstrated all three. Then why not him? Because he demonstrated them in the context of someone who knew he was capable of the outcome he was pursuing, she said. He fought 11 rounds and did not yield because he had a reasonable expectation of winning. That is a form of endurance. It is not the same form. I waited. You had no expectation of winning, she said. You knew before round 1 what the scoring margin was going to be. You knew before round 2 that none of your opponents were going to be unable to put you down if they could find the right moment, and you knew that most of them were going to find it eventually. You walked onto that floor every morning with complete information about your own position, and you stayed for the full clock anyway. That's what the 3 days looked like from the gallery, I said. Yes. And that's worth invoking an 800-year-old clause. She did not look away. Under the Kethvale Compact, the prize claim is not a property designation. It is a worth designation. It is a statement, recorded in the circuit's legal register, that this person demonstrates the qualities that my sovereign house values in a partner of the highest tier. She paused. The last time the clause was invoked on this circuit was 211 years ago. The person who invoked it was my ancestor, the 4th sovereign of the Velsorn line. The person she invoked it on was a compact diplomatic attaché who had remained at his post through a 9-day siege of the embassy compound rather than accept evacuation. He could have left. He did not. I sat with that for a moment. You've read the records. I have read the records, she said. I did not expect to invoke the clause. I did not arrive at the circuit with the intention of invoking it. I arrived because the Velsorn sovereignty holds an observer position on the circuit's governing council, and this is the 403rd season, and I was assigned the attendance. I watched round 2 because the results were statistically unusual. I watched rounds 3 through 11 because I wanted to understand what I was seeing. And what were you seeing? She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. When she did, she said, a man who had decided that the situation around him was not a sufficient reason to become a different person than he already was. It was the same phrase she had used later when she told me the story from her side. She had been working toward that description since round 2 and had arrived at it somewhere around round 8 and had not let go of it since. It was, she told me, the most precise way she could find to say what she had seen. I am not a man who is comfortable being observed that carefully. 22 years of infantry service produces a preference for being underestimated rather than accurately assessed. But there was something in the way she said it, not as a compliment, not as a statement designed to produce a particular response, but as a factual observation she had spent 3 days arriving at, that I found it difficult to argue with. That's a long way to go, I said, for a prize claim on a filler slot entrant. Yes, she said, it is. There's going to be opposition, I said, from your council. A human entrant from the security detail isn't the precedent your sovereign house is going to be comfortable with. There will be opposition, she agreed. There was opposition to my attending the circuit in an observer capacity rather than sending a representative. There was opposition to my choosing to remain in the gallery for 3 days rather than the mandatory single session. The opposition has not yet produced a result that required me to revise the decision that caused it. I looked at the legal officer. What happens if I formally object to the designation? He cleared his throat. The petition is filed, the chamber convenes for a 30-day review, and both parties remain in proximity status at the station during that period. And at the end of 30 days, if the chamber finds in favor of the objection, the designation is dissolved and both parties return to their prior status. If the chamber finds against the objection, the designation is confirmed, and the compact terms take effect with an additional 30-day adjustment period. I thought about this. What's the chamber's historical rate of finding in favor of the objecting party? The legal officer looked at me with the expression of someone who had not expected that particular question. He consulted his document. In the 17 recorded instances of prize claim designation under the Kethvale Compact, he said, the chamber has found in favor of the objecting party on 4 occasions. In 3 of those 4 instances, the objecting party subsequently revoked the objection during the review period and accepted the designation voluntarily. I looked at the princess. She was watching me with the same clear assessment she had been using since I walked in. So, I said, if I file the petition, I'm looking at 60 days of proximity status before I can be certain the designation dissolves. That is one reading of the statistical record, she said. Another reading is that the chamber has confirmed 14 of 17 designations, and in 3 of the 4 cases where objection was initially filed, the objecting party changed their mind. You're aware of the historical record on this. I told you I read the records. There was a silence. Outside, the docking ring continued its patient cycling. The legal officer looked between us with the careful expression of a person who is present at something he suspects will be remembered later and is trying to be appropriately discreet about it. Here is what I know, I said. I spent 3 days on that circuit floor. Every morning I walked out knowing what the round was going to look like, and I walked out anyway because the round wasn't over yet, and quitting before it was over seemed like the wrong answer. That's the whole of it. It's not a philosophy. It's not a decision I made because I was thinking about what it would look like from the outside. It's what I am. I know, she said. That's why I invoked the clause. And now you want a child, I said. Because the title of what this situation was going to become had been sitting in the back of my mind since the administrator explained the compact terms, and there was no elegant way to address it except directly. She did not flinch. The compact terms provide for the formal establishment of a sovereign bond, she said. The progression of that bond, including the question of children, is the choice of both parties under current compact governance law, which supersedes the 3rd century language on that specific point. No one can compel you to anything the current law does not permit. She paused. What I want, to be accurate, is the man who refused to yield for 11 rounds. What comes from that over time is what comes from it. I'm not presenting you with a contract for outcomes. I'm presenting you with a designation that says I looked at what you are and decided it was worth claiming. I sat with that for a long moment. 22 years of infantry service. The outer frontier, where the compact's authority was a suggestion. 2 repaired fractures and a hearing deficit, and the particular kind of stubbornness that develops when quitting is not an available option. A security detail position on an orbital circuit station. A filler slot bracket position, and 11 rounds and a nose that needed to be reset. I thought about the administrator's apology. I thought about Orvath's expression when she told me to stand up straight. I thought about Velkareth Sunorvath saying he had never been unable to put a man down, and the way he had sounded when he said it. I thought about a princess in a shadow gallery, watching from round 2, pulling up my service record on a terminal and staying for 3 days because she wanted to understand what she was seeing. I'm not going to file the petition, I said. The legal officer blinked. You're accepting the designation. I'm accepting the designation. The princess said nothing, but something in the quality of her stillness changed in a way that I noticed, which is to say it became slightly less still, in the specific way that stillness changes when a person has been holding themselves in a particular position for a long time and is now, with great care and no drama, allowing themselves to stop. The designation was processed. The witnesses recorded it. The legal officer filed the relevant documents with the circuit registry and the compact governance archive, and, somewhat reluctantly, the Velsorn Sovereignty's administrative office, where I gathered from his expression it was going to cause a specific kind of disruption that he was professionally glad to leave to other people to manage. Afterward, we were in a corridor on level 7, outside the chamber room, and the window at the end of the corridor looked down over the docking ring and the approach lanes beyond it. The station's position in the system put the primary star at an angle that made the approach lanes look like channels of light. "Your council is going to fight this," I said. "Yes," she said. "They are already composing the objection frameworks. I was informed of that before I came to the chamber this morning." "What grounds?" "Primarily that a human security contractor with a filler slot bracket position is not consistent with the dignity of a Velsorn sovereign designation." She paused. "Secondarily, that the Keth Vale Compact, while technically still operative, was not intended to apply to non-Velkareth system entrants, which is a textual argument that will require the Council's legal office to explain away approximately 4 of the 17 historical designations." "Will they be able to do it?" "No," she said, "but they will spend a significant amount of time trying, which is their right, and the attempt will produce a formal record that will need to be addressed. That is going to take time and require attention." "I've dealt with institutional opposition before," I said. She looked at me sidelong, "On the outer frontier." "Mostly, sometimes in command structures closer to home." I looked at the approach lanes. "I spent 6 years in places where the relevant authority was either very far away or very confused about what it actually governed. You learn to work within the framework without being stopped by the parts of it that haven't caught up yet." She was quiet for a moment. "The Council will request a formal assessment of the designation's validity, a panel, probably 3 or 4 sessions." "What do they assess?" "The 3 qualities," she said. "Sustained endurance, maintained composure under impossible odds, the refusal to dishonor the contest. They'll argue that the circuit record is insufficient evidence, and they'll want to conduct their own evaluation." "Fine," I said. She looked at me directly. "You understand that by their own evaluation, I mean they will attempt to design conditions under which you fail to demonstrate one of the 3 qualities." "I understand," I said. "They're going to try to make me yield." "Yes." I thought about this. Tell them I said they can try. It was the wrong thing to say, probably. It was the accurate thing. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face yet, which was something adjacent to the expression that Velkareth Sunorvath had worn after round 11, in the specific way that 2 very different people can arrive at the same expression from completely different directions. "You understand," she said carefully, "that I am not the kind of person who invoked that clause lightly." "I know," I said. "And that the things I said in the chamber, about what I saw across those 3 days, were accurate descriptions and not strategic presentations." "I know," I said again. "And that the question of children, which you raised in the chamber, I meant what I said. That's a choice for both of us over time, not a clause in a document." "I know," I said. "I raised it because it needed to be said clearly, and because I wanted to see how you handled it. You handled it well." She was quiet for a moment. Below the window, a docking ship was running its approach lights through the standard cycle, the sequence blinking in a pattern that had probably been identical on every compact docking station for 200 years. "I have never done anything like this before," she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of information. "Neither have I," I said. "What I know," she said, "is that I spent 3 days watching someone decide, over and over, that the situation around them was not a sufficient reason to change what they fundamentally were. And I decided that was worth standing up in a gallery and saying so where the record would carry it." I looked at her. 29 years old, third sovereign heir of the Velsorn line, pale gold eyes that had been watching carefully since round 2, a council that was already composing its objections, a designation that was now in the circuit registry and the compact governance archive and would remain there regardless of what the council's legal office argued, because 14 of 17 and 3 of the 4 who tried to walk away didn't. "Here's what I'm going to tell you," I said. "I accepted the designation. That means I'm here for what it is. The council's assessment panel, the objection framework, whatever they're going to throw at it, that's fine. I've been through worse, and I've been through it without the benefit of knowing at the end of it that there was someone in the gallery who was paying attention for a reason." She looked at me. Something in the quality of the pale gold eyes shifted in a way that was small enough to miss, and that I did not miss. "I'd also like to actually see the compact terms in full," I said, "because I don't make a habit of operating in frameworks I haven't read." "I have them in my document files," she said. "I can send them to your station access account." "Good," I said. "And the council's objection schedule when it's finalized." "That too." "And possibly," she said, "a copy of the fourth sovereign's original designation records. Since you seem like the kind of person who would want the historical precedent." "I would want that," I said. "Yes." There was a moment that had the quality of something settling into place, not dramatically. The approach lanes below the window continued their cycling. The station hum continued its steady background presence. Nothing around us changed. But something in the corridor between us was different than it had been when we walked in the specific way that two people can arrive at a shared understanding without either of them having said the words for it out loud. She sent me the compact terms that evening. She sent the historical designation records 2 hours after that, all 17, with the council's own commentary annotations from the review sessions, which told me considerably more about the council's reasoning patterns than any separate briefing could have. I read them with the same attention I had given to frontier operational briefings in the places where the compact's authority was a suggestion, which is to say, I read them completely and made notes about the parts that would matter. The council's first assessment session was scheduled for 8 days later. I went in the same way I had gone into round 1 on the circuit floor, with complete information about my own position and a clear assessment of what the session was designed to produce, and without any expectation that the session was going to go the way the council intended it to go. It did not go the way the council intended it to go. The council had designed the session around the assumption that a retired infantry sergeant from the outer frontier would be unfamiliar with the compact's formal procedures and uncertain of his standing under galactic contest law. The assumption was incorrect. I had spent the previous 8 days reading the relevant documents with the same attention I had given to operational briefings on the frontier, and I knew the framework I was operating in. The council's senior adjudicator, a Velsorn court official named Velthar Orvek, who had clearly expected to manage a straightforward review, spent 3 hours in the first session recalibrating his approach. He was, I thought, a fair-minded man operating under instructions that underestimated the subject of the review. I did not hold it against him. The designation held. What I found, across the weeks that followed the assessment sessions, the objection frameworks, the formal record that grew in the compact governance archive as the council's arguments were entered and addressed and filed, was that the thing the princess had said about me in the designation chamber was something I recognized, from the inside, as accurate, not as a statement about exceptional quality, as a statement about the particular form that ordinary quality takes when it is maintained long enough and carefully enough under sufficient pressure. The council wanted to call it stubbornness. The council was not entirely wrong. What the princess called it, in the formal statement she filed with the compact governance archive at the conclusion of the council's final review session, was sustained endurance, maintained composure under impossible odds, and the refusal to dishonor the contest through yielding before the round's natural conclusion. The same words as the clause. The same words she had said in the gallery above the circuit floor, on the last day of round 11, with the spectators making a noise I had not heard before and a nose I needed to have reset. They meant the same things in the governance archive as they had meant in the air above the circuit floor. That was the point. On the day the council's final review session concluded and the record was closed, we were back at the level 7 corridor window, because we had found that the window above the docking ring approach lanes was a useful place to have conversations, being neither the prize designation chamber nor the formal court session rooms that the council preferred for its deliberations. The approach lanes were cycling through their standard pattern. A ship was running its departure sequence, the docking locks releasing in the sequence that produced the low mechanical sound that the station's ventilation system carried to every corridor above level 4. "It's over," she said. "The council's review is over," I said. "The objection frameworks are filed. The record is closed." "What comes next," she said, "is different from what has been happening for the past 6 weeks. "Yes," I said, "it is." She looked at the approach lanes. "I want to be honest with you about something." "Go ahead." "When I stood in the gallery and invoked the clause," she said, "I knew what the compact terms were. I had read the records. I knew the council would oppose it. I knew the assessment process would be adversarial. I did not know entirely what I was doing beyond the fact that what I was doing was accurate. I waited. I knew what I had seen," she said. "I knew the clause existed. I knew that standing up and saying so where the record would carry it was the right response to what I had seen. I did not have a plan beyond that." "That's honest," I said. "I want you to know," she said, "that the question you raised in the chamber, the question of children, I meant what I said when I answered it. That's not a term in a document. That's a life. That's a thing that happens between 2 people over time if it happens, and the timeline and the decision are ours." "I know," I said. "But I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I hope it happens, not as a sovereign succession consideration, not as a clause in the compact. Because I spent 3 days watching someone be entirely and completely themselves under conditions designed to break that, and I think that particular quality is something the world could use more of." I looked at her for a moment. Pale gold eyes, dark silver hair coming slightly loose from the formal braid after 6 weeks of council sessions. The particular quality of someone who makes decisions and lives with them, and who has been living with this one for 6 weeks, and who has not, at any point, given any indication of wanting to revise it. "I think," I said, "that's the first time anyone has ever given me a reason for wanting children that had anything to do with what I actually am." Something in her expression changed, not dramatically. The approach lanes continued their cycling below. The docking ship completed its departure sequence, and the mechanical sound of the locks releasing faded into the station ambient. "There are going to be further complications," she said. "The Sovereign Council, the House protocols, the question of where we are stationed and how the compact terms interact with your security contractor registration and my sovereign attendance obligations." "I know," I said. "None of it is going to be simple." "None of it has been simple so far," I said, "and the record is still closed in our favor." She looked at me. The expression on her face was the one I had not been able to read fully on the first morning in the chamber room, when I walked in and she was standing at the window and turned to assess me. I could read it now. It was the expression of someone who has looked carefully at a situation and concluded that the situation is, on balance, what she thought it was. "Yes," she said, "it is." Below the window, the approach lanes settled into the slow pattern of the station's mid-cycle, the lights moving with the patient regularity of a system that has been running the same sequence for a very long time and intends to continue. I stayed at the window beside her, until the pattern completed its cycle. Then I went to collect the compact terms and the historical records that I had annotated across 6 weeks of council sessions, and I began the work of understanding the framework I was operating in. The round, as I have always understood it, was not over yet. We were still in it, that was the whole of it,